Okay. Um, and yeah, on questions, if anyone has questions that they would like to ask during the presentation, I'm totally fine having a conversation while I'm going through it, but I totally get why you'd stop recording and then have the Q&A period, so that's fine too. Um, I, Elise, I also really appreciate what you said about tribal sovereignty. I and the Wabanaki tribes. I read an article over the weekend about um, Golden and Terrio's position on tribal sovereignty, which prompted me to see if Harris or Trump have said anything about it. I wasn't able to find anything. I really wanted to add that to this presentation, but I could find like no information on it. So um, I'm going to talk about other things instead. Um, my name is Nick Janzen. Like Elise said, I'm the partnerships director at Maine Conservation Voters. I basically do two seemingly unrelated things that are connected through the fact that I do this work in partnerships with other organizations. But I lead our democracy work, and I also staff the Environmental Priorities Coalition. I joined MCV in March. I'm still pretty new. I was a clean energy attorney before that. I went to law school at Maine Law. I worked for the state Supreme Court for a year, and then I worked for a firm in Portland. Um, I learned a lot in private practice, and I am no longer in private practice for a reason. MCV is a much better fit for me, both like professionally, personally, the type of work we do. I'm really glad I did work as an attorney because that those skills and that like some of the projects I work on really help inform the work I do now. But it was definitely not a forever home. Um, I also just wanted to share by way of this conversation that my views on climate justice are very much informed by where I grew up in New Orleans and particularly by a few sort of environmental catastrophes, namely Katrina, the BP oil spill, and just Louisiana's general wetland loss crisis between damming the Mississippi River and then oil and gas canals that have been dredged in the state. And sea level rise, Louisiana is losing its wetlands and it doesn't have the ability to replenish its wetlands through the natural processes that formed them. Um, those catastrophes are also linked in that while they have climate connections, they are fundamentally human disasters. They're caused by this sort of human Western view of controlling nature. And it's also a view that very much does not center Black voices, Brown voices, and Indigenous voices. Whether that's like through the creation of the oil and gas industry in Louisiana or in the responses to those catastrophes. So um, that's part of what motivates my own work on climate change and on climate justice issues. Um, so when I talk about climate justice, this is what I'm talking about, at least a response to the climate crisis that really places the costs of a climate transition on the entities who caused the crisis, on oil and gas companies and fossil fuel companies. And it's a response that distributes the benefits of the transition to the people who have been most harmed by a fossil fuel powered economy, both in the United States and across the globe. Um, Elise kind of alluded to this. The two candidates could not be more different on climate issues and climate justice issues. I thought about like pulling a bunch of quotes and then playing a game where we sort of guess who said it, and there's no way to really do that. But uh, Harris has called climate change an existential threat. Trump has called it a hoax. Um, Harris recognizes that market forces alone are not going to um, reduce the impacts of climate change. That is, I think, kind of like a floor that we all need to be at. A capitalist system that caused the climate crisis is not inherently capable of coming up with the solution to the problem it caused. Um, During Trump's first term in office, he rolled back more than 125 rules and regulations that would have either reduced greenhouse gas emissions or protected the environment. Um, and it, Furthermore, there aren't actually any real market solutions that he's going to bring to bear either, at least not that I could find. So even if you don't agree with that distinction, there's still not much there to look to from Trump. Um, the Inflation Reduction Act is the largest piece of climate legislation the U.S. ever passed. This is kind of going to be a theme tonight. I mean, a lot of what I've been able to locate as Harris's policies from this year are a continuation of Biden administration policies. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the things she advocated for when she was running in 2020 for president. Um, she's saying very different things now than she did then. I have to assume that is sort of a strategic electoral decision. But it is interesting to see the difference. The implication of that, though, is that a lot of what I'm going to say tonight is she's going to keep doing the same thing Biden did. Um, Trump not down with the IRA. He wants to rescind any unspent funds. That's actually kind of an interesting like legal question that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Um, and then offshore wind. And if you're wondering why, like I'm talking about these specific things to provide an overview, this is mostly what the national media is covering. And then I'm going to dig in a little bit more to some things that I think are like relevant to Maine specifically and relevant globally, both of which don't get covered quite as much, but just to set the stage. Offshore wind is being talked a lot about during this election. Um, the Biden-Harris administration is halfway to its 30 gigawatt goal. Kamala Harris has pledged to continue that work. Um, you know, Trump literally said that everyone thinks the wind is great, the wind is great, the wind is bullshit. I don't really know what that is supposed to mean exactly, but we will not have any new offshore wind under a Trump presidency, I think is his point in saying that. So I want to talk about offshore wind specifically because it's from a justice perspective, I think it's really important to Maine in particular. As far as the New England states go, Maine is a relatively poor state. We have a really high energy burden because of fossil fuels and particularly fossil fuel heating sources. Offshore wind has its highest capacity factor in the winter when we need more demand and when we most often will in New England turn on those oil and gas fired peaker plants to sort of meet that high load caused by needing heat. Um, Maine has also, as I'm sure you all know a lot better than I do, having only moved here in 2021. Maine has been hit really hard by, some industries closing, particularly paper mills, and the deployment and installation certainly, and potentially even the sort of fabrication and manufacturing of some offshore wind components is really well suited to communities in Maine that have a strong labor force and really like highly skilled people who no longer have a place to use those skills and to have those jobs. Offshore wind can provide that. And that's kind of the justice piece to this conversation. So the Biden administration has set a goal to have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind built by 2030. They're about halfway there. They also have a goal, or specifically the Department of the Interior has a goal of having 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2035. The state of Maine has a goal of having procuring 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2040. And just because I think it's interesting, I just want to talk about procurements for a minute because they're kind of complicated and folks don't talk about them a lot. And I think it's important that people understand how the state is sort of positioning and developing its own climate policy, particularly as it relates to offshore wind. Um, so to make a very complicated story short, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the electric utility industry in the United States um, underwent something called deregulation or restructuring. And it used to be that utilities like CMP and Versant not only owned the poles and wires, the distribution infrastructure and transmission infrastructure that it still owns, but it also owned the power plants and the fuel sources that generated the electricity that was distributed over the T&D system. Deregulation ended that practice, and so in New England now, T&D utilities no longer own those generation sources. With that understanding, these procurements, this 3 gigawatt goal for floating offshore wind in Maine, it's essentially the state of Maine ordering CMP and Versant to buy a certain type of generation, here offshore wind. And we do this with other clean energy sources. This is actually basically like how this is a huge pillar of clean energy policy in Maine, is this procurement mechanism. Um, so that's what we mean when we say the state has a goal of 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind. They're going to procure it. They're going to order the T&D utilities to buy this power. And with that, the hope is that offshore wind developers feel confident building projects in the Gulf of Maine in proximity to a place where CMP and Versant can buy that energy. So just with that understanding in mind, Vice President Harris has pledged to do a few things related to offshore wind. One is continue Biden's Justice 40 policy, which sets a goal of directing 40% of the benefits of certain federal clean energy investments to communities that have been historically overburdened by pollution and marginalized by lack of investment. She's also pledged to continue implementing offshore wind provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm going to speak more broadly about the IRA in a minute, but related to offshore wind, there's a few pieces of that that are really important. So it's it's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management continuing to hold leases for offshore wind projects on the outer continental shelf, so that there's a physical space in the ocean where these projects can be developed. There's also some tax credits, namely the ITC, which scales up. There's a 6% floor. Any wind project qualifies for a 6% tax credit, but they can get up to 40% by having apprenticeship programs, prevailing wage requirements in the build out, and having certain domestic content and manufacturing provisions. And all of those things are essentially designed to funnel money that would otherwise go to the offshore wind developer to the workers who actually build the project. So from a justice perspective and from helping workers and low-income communities who may be situated near a port or near the staging point for a project, these are really important tax provisions, essentially, that direct money to those communities that wouldn't otherwise go there. Trump has promised to issue an executive order on his first day in office to end offshore wind. I don't know what all would go into that, but he would almost certainly either not hold or delay any BOEM lease sales and he would slow off the permitting process, which we saw in his first administration, and which he has um, pretty much complete authority to do. It's very difficult legally to make an agency issue a permit quickly, absent some sort of congressional legislation directing them to. And even then, it's hard because courts can't really like force government employees to issue the permit faster, right? That, um, there are things that sort of transcend um, the other branches of government's ability to demand from other branches, and this is one of those areas. Um, I think the two things that really stand out to me or that would really help Maine in this area is expanded port funding. There was some from the IRA. We actually learned today that Maine is not going to get any of the money from that first bucket that they had applied for. So um, either the Harris administration finding like a creative way to direct existing money to Maine for ports, or congressional appropriation for new money. The other piece that I don't think either candidate has spoken about, and in particular Harris, um, is having a public power authority. So having basically, it would most likely be the state government, but creating a sort of legal environment that's conducive to Maine, creating an authority that essentially acts as like a developer of last resort or a backstop that would agree to purchase the power and do so at a lower cost of capital than a private investor would have access to in order to get these projects built and going. They're just from a capital perspective, it takes a lot of money up front to build an offshore wind project. Once they're built, the operating costs are really low. There are no fuel costs. So there's a lot of savings to be had on the back end. But it's still difficult for companies at this stage to get all of that capital together on the front end. And where projects stall out, that's an area where we can really like bring public dollars to bear in a way that gets projects going and then gets some of those capital dollars to workers and to low income communities who can benefit the most from them and who would not otherwise have access to them if the project dies out completely. Um, the next sort of policy area I wanted to talk about is the Inflation Reduction Act. It's gotten a ton of media attention. It's something that the Republican Party has decided to sort of like fight against in its messaging. And it is something that environmental organizations did not all support, even at the time of passage, and maybe still don't now, because it was definitely a compromise bill. It was it was a compromise bill in a few ways, but um, there are still provisions in it that provide money, direct money to fossil fuel companies or fossil fuel technology. There are also provisions designed to aid particularly low income people, but in a way that like doesn't actually work for low income people by requiring them to have money up front for home efficiency investments or electric vehicles, and then they get money on the back end instead of just giving that money to folks directly. But it is also true that there's a lot in the IRA that does help low income people and does help Black and Brown and Indigenous people. And that will either, if Harris is elected, continue to be implemented, or if Trump is elected, will not to the best of his ability. Um, so I list what some of those provisions are on the slide here. Um, Trump has pledged to hold up this money as best he can. I mentioned before, legally, I think this is really interesting in the sense that once Congress has appropriated funds, the president is not technically allowed not to spend them. There's this process a president can go through where they tell Congress they don't want to spend the funds, and then Congress has a 45-day window to themselves choose to recall the appropriation. But if they don't do that, technically, the president is supposed to spend that money. Now, obviously, there's things he can do to slow that down. He can just delay sending it to states or to grant recipients. He can change guidance so that it's, you know, so that like money is going to projects it wasn't intended to. Hydrogen is gets sort of caught in this bucket a lot. There's a lot of hydrogen tax credits available through the IRA. Regulations to date have sort of directed that money to projects where hydrogen is created from a clean energy source, but you can certainly imagine it being directed to projects that generate hydrogen from natural gas, for example, and that would really defeat the climate purpose of having hydrogen projects. So there's, while he can't like not spend the money entirely forever, there's a lot he can do to slow it down, and there's a lot of delay and therefore harm that would occur as a result of that. Um, and here I was just going to mention, like, this is another area where Harris has just sort of said, I'm going to keep implementing the IRA. I'm going to keep doing what the Biden administration did. And she'll sort of hang her hat on that instead of talking more boldly and explicitly about like innovative and new climate policies the way she did in 2020. At that time, she advocated for eliminating the filibuster so that the Green New Deal could be passed. And for as much good as the Inflation Reduction Act is doing, it is a long way from the Green New Deal, which very explicitly phases out fossil fuels. It very explicitly holds oil and gas companies accountable for climate damage. And centers it centers climate justice in a way that the IRA and its very like tax credit technocratic veneer does not do. I'm hopeful that it's just a sort of campaign decision, but we'll see. I would much rather, push a President Harris to sign the Green New Deal and continue implementing the IRA, though, than I would want to deal with like legal challenges to regulatory guidance from the Trump administration that are designed to sort of self-defeat the IRA. The last area I wanted to talk about was sort of like the international climate space. This is John Kerry signing the Paris Climate Accords, and as much damage as the climate crisis is going to do to the United States, we are still the richest country in the world, and it pales in comparison to some of the damage that's going to occur across the globe. Again, candidates have very different positions here. Harris generally accepts the international order. Trump does not. This was one of the early issues where he really distinguished himself from other Republican candidates when he first ran. He's rejected free trade agreements. He wants to do things like pull out of NATO, and he did withdraw the United States from the Paris Accords. Just something I had kind of forgotten about that I found interesting while I was putting this together. You might like remember from civics class that the Senate is supposed to ratify treaties that the US is a party to. And that is true. When the Paris Accords were signed, there was a Republican Senate, and Obama essentially found out that the Senate was not going to ratify that as a treaty. So the US approaches Paris as just sort of this agreement that it voluntarily participates in, rather than a treaty that it is legally obliged to uphold. That's why Trump could pull out of the Paris Agreement without congressional action. And that's why Biden could put us back into the agreement without congressional action. So that's just like a little interesting background that I learned. Um, I also want to talk about Paris specifically because I think it's easy to sort of brush past it a little bit, but it was signed in 2016, and that was the very first time that nearly all countries agreed to act on climate. And that's extremely significant. Up until that point, there had been previous climate agreements, but they've all been developed at some subset of all of the countries on the planet. So I think um, it's Iran, which is sort of the only significant greenhouse gas contributor, and then I think it's Libya and Yemen who also haven't signed on. But this was an enormous accomplishment. It set a goal of um, keeping global warming under 2 degrees Celsius with a sort of um, even less binding, hopeful goal of keeping warming to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there's a couple features of it that I want to talk about here. One is this principle called common but differentiated responsibilities. So this is sort of a fundamental principle that underpins all of the UN climate agreements, and it basically means two things. All countries share a responsibility to protect the environment, but not all countries are obligated to protect the environment in the same way, essentially because some countries did not cause or contribute to climate change, and some countries just don't have the economic capacity to help resolve the climate crisis. Um, this leads to, so in the language of the agreement, the parties are basically split into two camps. There are uh, developed economy parties and developing economy parties. Today, we would sort of think about this as the global north and global south, but that's the language the treaty uses. And um, the sticking point is essentially how much money the U.S. and the other developed economies will pay to the developing countries for economic losses, both economic losses caused by climate impacts and economic losses or sort of foregone economic opportunity that um, countries experience by not modernizing their economy in the same way as countries like the US and Britain and Germany did, that is, by relying on fossil fuels. So currently, spending levels are sort of in the like single digit $billion flowing from the developed economies to developing economies. Um, the developing parties have called for over $1 trillion, and that's really is what it's going to cost, hundreds of billions to $1 trillion. Um, Harris has said she would stay in the Paris Agreement. It seems like she would sort of maintain that current spending level. Um, Trump has pledged to pull out of the Paris Agreement. He would not devote any new funds, and he's talked about getting back sort of the most recently spent funds that have gone into these climate funds. There's like current spending levels are nowhere near sufficient. Um, this isn't something that gets talked about in campaigns a lot. It's kind of nitty gritty, and when you're talking to a U.S. electorate, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for candidates to talk about what they're going to do for other people who can't vote for them. But um, you know, current spending levels are nowhere near good enough. We essentially need a program where we are paying countries to not extract fossil fuels, to not burn fossil fuels, to pay for the damage that we have cause by creating climate change and giving developing economies the clean energy technology they need to modernize their economy to get to the same place we did, just by a different means. And I think that's only going to happen, like, that's what the developing countries are asking for and have always asked for. I think that only changes when the developed economies elect people who accept that argument. And until then, I don't think we're going to see a lot of progress um, on sort of the international front when it comes to these agreements. But yeah, so that's what I wanted to share with you all tonight. I'm happy to share these slides.